Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Stephanie Traina and I'm in charge of adult programming and community services at Memorial Hall Library in Andover. The library is very pleased to partner with the Addison Gallery on today's program. The Addison is celebrating its 90th anniversary this year. Gordon Wilkins, the Robert M. Walker Associate Curator of American Art, will share his explorations of the museum's archives and the stories behind them. If you've not heard one of Gordon's lectures, you're in for a real treat. This is a Zoom webinar, so your cameras and microphones are off. I've enabled captions, which you can turn on or off at your end. Send your questions through the Q&A box, and there will be time at the end for Gordon to answer those. Today's program is being recorded, and it will eventually be on the library's website. You'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording. So please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Gordon Wilkins.
Hi, thank you so much, as always, Stephanie, for being such a great partner. We also really are pleased to be able to join with Memorial Hall Library to bring a wide variety of public programs, and especially virtual programs over the last year or so. So let's get right into it. I say that, and then there we go. So the conversation that I'm hoping to have today is about the Addison's archives. So the Addison is celebrating our 90th anniversary this year and opened to the public in May of 1931. And we have a whole slate of programs that we've been offering throughout the year and will continue to offer, centered around a major permanent collection installation that takes up all of the galleries on our first floor. And the installation itself is called Learning to Look, the Addison at 90. And it unfolds across 5 galleries, all of our major first floor galleries, a smaller conference room gallery with a really focused installation on Edward Hopper's Manhattan Bridge Loop, which I'll be talking about. And then there's a related exhibition in our Museum Learning Center, or MLC, that goes into greater depth about the institution's history, drawing from the archives in order to tell that story. And so when I talk about the archive or archives, the Addison is very fortunate in that every slip of paper that was ever written upon, really in the first, let's say, 40 or so years of the institution's history was very meticulously retained. And so we have really quite a voluminous amount of material from that time period, from really 1931 up until the late 1960s. The 1960s and 70s were, a heady time and a fascinating time for everyone. And record keeping here was a tumultuous time as well. So I don't know if that impacted record keeping, probably not, but there isn't great record keeping from that time period. And then we pick back up in the 80s and forward with far more robust record keeping. That isn't to say that they weren't keeping records, but compared to 1930s, 40s, when everything that was sent out was kept, a carbon copy of every letter that was sent out was kept, all of the return correspondence was kept, every receipt was kept, every message was kept. Comparatively lean years during the 60s and 70s. So the material is also, we're very fortunate enough to be able to access it quite readily. Some institutions don't have their archive right on site. We're very fortunate that our archive is located just a stone's throw from our office. And so we were able to consult materials. And I'll break down the sort of 3 main portions or segments of this archive before I go into greater depth about the exhibition and draw in some of the great treasures of our archive in order to tell a robust, nuanced story about our history. So you'll notice these beautiful high-density compact shelving units. You don't want to get trapped in between those, but they are a way in order to maximize storage in tight quarters. So this is actually not a very large room, but we're able to store a great deal of material there due to this high-density shelving. And so within the shelves, This is just a shot of one of the sections of our archive dealing with artist files. So you'll notice it looks like of course now everything's online, but it looks like an old fashioned doctor's office where every patient has a file. So instead of patients, here we have artists, and each artist has one of these brown folders. And within those folders, we keep all kinds of information, some from very general research information to far more specific conservation information about specific works in the collection, artist correspondence, exhibition notes. If the work ever goes out on loan, we keep all of that material in the artist file. And some artist files are quite slim. If we have one work by a particular artist, for example, it can be quite a thin file, whereas others are extraordinarily robust. You can imagine, if you know anything about our collection, that our Winslow Homer files, we have hundreds of works by Winslow Homer in our collection, and that fills up almost an entire one of these shelves that you see in front of us. So it does vary. But we do have at the very base level a file for every artist represented in our collection. And then within that, we have a file for every object in our collection. So we have 23,000 objects, and nearly every object has its own file. So you can imagine there's a lot of paper here. Of course, most of this is most of what we now archive in our 21st century time. We are archiving digitally, but we also do try our best to keep hard copies of important information. And certainly we print out important emails and that kind of thing as a backup to put in the files. So this is one part of the archive. We also have exhibition files. So we have 90 years of exhibition files. Every exhibition, just like every artist, has its own file. And again, some of those files can be quite expansive. Major exhibitions over the years, and particularly more recent exhibitions, almost an entire row will be, or shelf rather, will be taken up by a single exhibition. But you can see here, this is the first segment. It starts at the top with 1931 and continues on. What's also quite remarkable going through these files is just the sheer number of exhibitions that were offered at the Addison in the very early years. We think, today we're known for really cycling and rotating quite frequently at a pace that alarms most of our colleagues who can't imagine having to be responsible for multiple permanent collection exhibitions a year, plus special loan exhibitions, installations, etc. But back in the 30s and 40s, exhibitions were up for just about a month or so. And so they had to go through dozens of shows in order to fill the space every year. It was also a much less complicated time in terms of shipping art and traveling shows. They insured objects by weight. And so you can imagine it was far less expensive than it is now. Trying to move millions of dollars worth of art across the country and world can get quite pricey. In those days, you just kind of came in crates, you put it on the train, and it went off to its next destination. It was a simpler time, not necessarily a better time though. And finally, in this little preamble, we have our administrative files. This might look a little daunting, and I assure you that it is. We are fortunate though, and I have to thank my colleagues and the colleagues that came before me for their tireless efforts to create finding aids for these boxes, which have, as I mentioned at the beginning, really every scrap of paper that was ever generated at the Addison over a very long period of time. We also retain all of our publications. We have multiple copies of every publication we've been responsible for in our archive, as well as information related to our along with acquisition logs. We have scrapbooks. There's just a lot of material. The only downside, and something that I hope in time we can rectify, is the fact that this material, which is really a treasure trove for anyone who would be interested in the history of American art and the history of museums of American art and of collecting, is really we really do, and I hope that we'll be able to digitize this archive. That, of course, takes lots of money, lots of time, lots of resources. So that will be an ongoing project. But the dream goal would be to have this amazing archive, particularly our administrative and exhibition files, digitized and searchable, hopefully in the not too distant future. So back to the matter at hand, which is the Addison's 90th anniversary. I always start when I'm talking about the history of the Addison with our founder, Thomas Cochrane, who was a member of Phillips Academy's class of 1890, and here is his photograph. He was a fascinating figure in American history. He was a real financial tycoon and worked for, was a partner at JP Morgan's firm for some time, also had his own financial firms. He was really a man that was respected and listened to in all kind of matters related to finance. There was a story of him making kind of an off the cuff comment before he boarded a ship for a transatlantic crossing, that the comment was something about, buy Ford stock. And by the time he had reached England, Ford's stock had skyrocketed. So he was extraordinarily powerful. And over the course of his life, and particularly in the latter part of his life, when he really focused with an obsessive level of attention on Phillips Academy and transforming the Phillips Academy. By all accounts, he had what in today's parlance would be described as quite a manic personality, perhaps bipolar. There are fascinating anecdotes of him just coming like the Tasmanian devil up to Andover and deciding that he wanted this building moved in that direction, and he wanted to find a place to put his auk, and he also wanted to make a museum of nature and history, and he had a million ideas, but really it stemmed from his abiding love for the school and his vision of Andover as this kind of beacon of educational excellence. And also, and something that I think was quite unique to him, he also understood that there was no way that you could separate art and aesthetics and beauty from any sort of school curriculum. So while the trustees of Phillips Academy at the time did not really see the need for an endowed Museum of American Art, he thought that it would be an incredible way to cultivate, in his words, cultivate and foster in them, being the students of Phillips Academy, a love for the beautiful, which was really central to him. He thought, they can get a first-rate education, but what is a student, what is a young man at that time without culture, without, why should they not be able to experience a bird sanctuary or walk down a beautifully landscaped path? And so working with Charles Platt, he quite radically transformed Phillips Academy's campus. One of his most lasting legacies is the Addison, but he's responsible for so much more. For example, the chapel, the bird sanctuary, as I mentioned, George Washington Hall, Samuel Phillips Hall, the Commons. He donated somewhere around $10 million to Phillips Academy, which is roughly $200 million today. So an extraordinary amount of money. And it should also be noted that the Addison was built and the collection for the Addison was acquired in large part during the Depression. So he was extraordinarily affluent. He survived the Depression fairly well, but died really soon after the Addison opened, which is quite unfortunate, leaving no heirs. His wife passed away, and he knew that his real legacy would be in his philanthropic endeavors. So here we have the very first painting to enter the Addison's collection. This is Arthur Bowen Davies' Mountain Beloved of Spring. And what I have next to it on the screen, and this is an object that's actually installed right now in our Museum Learning Center, is the original accession log for the Addison. You can see right at the top, 1928.1, which was the first year that works were accessioned for the Addison. The Addison wouldn't open until 1931, but the collection was in place starting in 1928. And not only did Thomas Cochrane, acting as an anonymous donor, seed an incredible collection or provide the funds to accumulate an incredible collection, but he actually drew on his connections in New York City to some of the leading arts patrons and connoisseurs of his time in order to accumulate works for his museum. And he called upon Lizzie Bliss, or Lily Bliss, who's pictured here and who actually donated the very first work to enter the collection. She's perhaps better known for being one of the founders of the Museum of Modern Art. And there's an incredible relationship between the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney, and the Addison, as they were all founded within the same 3-year or so time period, and were the same people that were involved in the founding of the Whitney, and MoMA were also very deeply involved in the founding of the Addison. So there's an amazing historical relationship between these three institutions. And for those reasons, really, the Addison has always been far more aligned with New York City than it has been with Boston, for better or for worse. So something that a lot of people don't know is that before the Addison opened its doors, the part of the collection was actually installed here on campus in the trustees room. This is in George Washington Hall, and you can see in the photograph some recognizable works from the collection. On the far left, you see the West Wind. You can also see the Arthur Davies painting that we just talked about hanging over the fireplace. There's a John Singer Sargent to the right of that, and a fair, beautiful portrait that's up right now on the far left. So in his terms of trust, Cochrane established that the Addison would be a museum dedicated solely to the art of the United States. They described it, in fact, as indigenous or native art, meaning not indigenous or native in our terms or our point of reference today, but works of art created by artists who were either born in the United States or were naturalized US citizens. And so under his terms of trust, we are allowed to show any work by any artist, but in order to enter the Addison's collection, we have to abide by the terms of trust, meaning that all artists in our collection have to have either been native born or naturalized US citizens, which is, I think in today's kind of makes your skin crawl thinking in today's terms, but thinking about the context, of course, there was this rise of nativism in the United States during the Great Depression, but there also was a very real sort of disrespect or disinterest in the art of the United States. And Thomas Cochrane was really responding to that very real lack of interest, where the great perception, even amongst Americans, was that American art was really just European pastiche, that American artists really didn't have much original to say, but were too far heavily influenced by Europeans. And Cochrane wanted to show that there is this incredible body of work produced by artists who hailed from the United States. So he went about constructing a museum. And so we have two photographs here. On the left, we have photograph taken during the early days of construction in 1930 of the Addison. And then you can see on the left, on the right of your screen, a photograph of the stone chapel, which was a Gothic revival chapel that was that would have been, if it existed today, located directly next to the Addison. And it was actually up. It was destroyed or bulldozed because Cochrane really had a very kind of visceral aversion to Victorian architecture. And there was some really beautiful Victorian Gothic revival architecture here at Andover, but that did not really conform to Cochrane and Platt's aesthetic sensibilities, so it was quite simply removed. Here's another photograph of the Addison under construction. And during the course of construction, very detailed records were kept. On the left, we have an installation plan, kind of how they were starting to think about the curation of the interior spaces at the Addison. This is a plan of the second floor of the Addison. Gallery number 1 being the beautiful large gallery with the Sol LeWitt mural wall piece circling the perimeter. And then you see the 4 galleries that branch off, and then the 6 through 9 is what we call it. And then on the right, you can see part of a list of all of the suppliers that were utilized in the construction of the Addison. So they were drawing from dozens and dozens of different suppliers to furnish everything from marble to to limestone to screens, stairs, etc. Something that is not in our archive and not in our collection, unfortunately, though, if anyone has seen this painting, please let me know. Childe Hassam, and I'll get back to this story at the end of the talk. Childe Hassam was actually invited by Thomas Cochrane and Robert McIntyre, who was Cochrane's most trusted art advisor and a principal at the Macbeth Gallery in New York. Childe Hassam was invited to come to campus in 1930 to capture Andover scenes, in the hopes that he would produce something that would be important enough, significant enough to enter the Addison's collection. And I'll tell you how that ended, which was not well. But we do know that he painted a work called Building the Art Museum, Andover, Mass. And we have this black and white reproduction of it. It has not been seen since the 1930s and is missing in action. The people who are assembling the catalog raisonné of Childe Hassam's work have not been able to locate it. But you can see the Addison quite clearly, but then the remnants of the stone chapel on the left. We also are fortunate enough to have several plans for the Addison's construction. The main blueprints and design drawings are kept at the Avery Library at Columbia, which houses Charles Platt's archive. But we do have things like this really beautiful drawing for a light fixture on the left, and then a plan of the exhibition hall preliminary study, which you can see is the rotunda with the iconic manship fountain anchoring the center, which really the rotunda was planned around the fountain in many respects. And there's actually some thought that the circular kind of quality nature of the space is meant to reference the sculpture itself. So there's an interesting relationship there. But you can see the intricate marble work being planned out in this drawing. And this is hanging, in fact, right in the rotunda. So when you come to visit, which we are open to the public, I hope that you'll take note of this when you enter. It's directly on the right, and you can kind of do a compare and contrast and see how close to the finished product this plan is. Here's some architectural details of the rotunda that were taken very shortly after the Addison opened. Beautiful plaster work, really beautiful stonework. This was a museum with a great deal of thought put into it. It was purpose built. This is not a museum that was, a former factory building. This was a museum that was built to be a museum. And we are really fortunate because we're lucky enough to work with a space that is scaled sort of not in the grand way of what we think of as most museums, but it's far more intimate. Symmetry is really key to understanding the design of this building. And it's something that we really have to work with rather than against. We're really bound by the symmetry, which in most cases is actually not that much of a hindrance. Here's the opening. You can see that the chapel still stood when the Addison opened its doors in May of 1931. And the people who were invited were really was a who's who of the museum and art world of that time. I found a list of all the invitations that were sent out. Fortunately, most people had other things to do, but it's everyone from Alfred Barr, from MoMA to Duncan Phillips to Paul Sachs, the very famous instructor of museum and art, museum history and practice, rather, at Harvard, who was a mentor to our first curator/director. We also have, which is kept in our archive, the dedication day guest book, which you can see on the right-hand side. And this is the very first page. There were multiple openings. There was a private opening that was really restricted to Cochrane and his guests, primarily guests from New York, friends from New York. There are some artists listed: Barry Faulkner, who did many of the beautiful murals on campus. Paul Manship was at the opening. So it's a fun thing to go through to kind of see the names of who showed up for the opening of the Addison. We also have, this was a souvenir that was printed out and distributed, Thomas Cochrane's dedication that he delivered at Andover. And at that time and throughout his life, he wished to remain anonymous. So in all of the newspapers it was a terribly kept secret, but he was never explicitly listed as the founder or principal benefactor of the Addison. The Addison itself is named not after someone in Thomas Cochrane's family, but actually, or himself. He named it after the mother of his dear friend, Zadie Cobb Bliss. And he also was quite a shrewd businessman, as I mentioned, and he was aware that Addison, with A, would list quite high in any alphabetical listing of museums. But he dedicates the Addison to Keturah Addison Cobb, who was well remembered here. The opening of the Addison was quite big news. We are one of the very first museums dedicated to principally or chiefly to American art. So that was quite an ordeal, or quite an anomaly in that time. You can see here there was a large article in the New York Times. Really everyone in the Northeast covered it. It was also the subject of many reviews in the leading arts presses of the time. And you can see our predecessors kept very detailed and scrapbooks of all of the press mentions. So we're very fortunate to have clippings that go back to even before the opening, and they're stored in these portfolios. So I decided to pull this out and put it on display, just to give a sense of a very small portion of the vast amount of press coverage the Addison received. So here we are at the Addison, learning to look the Addison at 90. The Addison, this show, it was sort of it's always difficult to create an exhibition around an anniversary of an institution, because you're always going to leave some artist out. You're going to upset someone because their favorite painting isn't in the show. For us, we knew that we couldn't please everyone, and we knew that we couldn't tell the entire complete story of the Addison. We also knew that since we have 23,000 objects, not everything was going to make the cut. And instead of trying to come up with some overarching kind of rigid theme, we thought instead about kind of drawing works together that told a story about the institution. They're all significant pieces in an art historical context, but they're also quite significant works in terms of the institutional history of the Addison. So we wanted to choose works that were very significant and had stories to tell. So when you come to the exhibition, you'll notice our wall labels are not full of art historical interpretation. Instead, we have factoids, sort of fun facts, or at least fun to us, stories, anecdotes about how the work was acquired, how the work was received by the Addison, how the artist was involved or not involved, etc. One of the most iconic works in our collection, of course, is Winslow Homer's 8 Bells. And this painting was extraordinarily well known, extraordinarily famous by the time that the Addison opened its doors in 1931. It's not a work that was unknown to the public. It was exceptionally well known, largely through print reproductions. And when it was purchased by Thomas Cochrane in 1930 for the collection, that was quite newsworthy. We have the telegram here from Robert McIntyre to James C. Sawyer, describing or announcing that the great James C. Sawyer was the treasurer of the Academy, and was the father of our inaugural curator / director. So he says, we've just secured the brush painting in the great Homer 8 Bells, for which we have been negotiating these past 2 months. Part of the reason why it made such news is not only was it famous, but it was also the most expensive work of American art ever sold up to that time. So Thomas Cochrane paid around $68,000 in 1930 for 8 Bells, which of course made the news, and translates to over $1 million in 2021 when you adjust for inflation. Something else that I've included, so we actually have the receipt for 8 Bells on display. You can see William Macbeth, the painting, then the commission. They got a nice 5% commission, was paid to Macbeth Gallery. And then one of my favorite things is are these certificates of authenticity, which is, I think, quite quaint by today's standards that we would trust this document. And unfortunately, not all of the works that have these certificates of authenticity are necessarily authentic. But this is a certificate of authenticity certified by Macbeth Gallery that Cochrane purchased the genuine article. We also in our archive, and this is something that I pulled out and displayed, we have a letter, and I don't expect you to be able to read this handwriting, so well, if you can, I'm very impressed. We have a letter from the original owner of the painting, Thomas B. Clark, who was a prolific collector of American art, and his collection was sold off in the 1890s at a very famous sale. And his works from his collection have been dispersed all around the United States. But this is a letter from the original owner to Thomas Cochrane, just expressing his delight that this painting, along with several others from formerly in Clark's collection, were to be on display at the Addison. He tells a story of visiting Winslow Homer at his studio. And he says, in the 90s, Mr. Homer invited me to come to his studio in the Benedict on Washington Square. I called there and the artist asked me to look at the canvas, which he said he had named 8 Bells. When I saw the picture, I received a thrill of delight that occasionally comes to a collector. And I said, Mr. Homer, will you sell that painting to me for my collection of American art? Yes, promptly answered the artist, and I will let you have it for $400. Of course, I acquired the picture, for I felt that it was a masterpiece. So $400 in the 1890s was certainly not a paltry sum, but again, it's often a fun exercise to look back at relative prices of works of art at different points of time. And 8 Bells, again, a great masterwork in our collection. And it touched kind of a point of reference for generations of visitors, particularly Phillips Academy students. So I'm sort of working our way through the exhibition. This is not a tour of the exhibition. This is a archives kind of specific or centric tour. So I'm highlighting works that have significant archival materials connected to them. What's great is that you can see the painting and then just walk over to the Museum Learning Center to see the documents. And we reference that there are documents connected to the paintings in the wall tables. So there's a really interesting conversation between the galleries and the Museum Learning Center. We initially thought that we might display the archival materials with the works, but again, with 23,000 objects, we overshot, what we call it, we put far too many works on our collection than could physically fit in the space. And so we had to make some very tough decisions, and there was just no room for anything other than artwork in this installation. Here we have West Wind, another work that was formerly owned by Thomas Clark. And the reason that I have it here is because there's this incredible letter that came with it. And again, I don't expect you to be able to read this. This was written by Florence Lord King, who's actually the woman depicted in the painting. And this letter is on display at in the Museum Learning Center. And she expresses, and it was in a letter to Thomas Cochrane, that she had been walking around the bluffs at Prouds Neck in Maine, near where Winslow Homer had his studio. She was friends with Homer's sister-in-law, and she remembered that Homer was kind of watching her as she walked in the wind with her hat and cloak kind of very flapping behind her in a very animated manner, but she had no idea that she'd been painted at all until she saw this painting. So she expressed her delight and surprise in this letter. So again, we're able to tell these incredible stories about paintings, not just because of their value in terms of an art historical, cultural sense, but also these personal, very intimate stories of, a letter from the subject of this, masterpiece. That's something that we're very fortunate, material that we're very, very fortunate to hold. Here's just an overview of this first gallery. We're moving into the next gallery, stopping at this Thomas Hart Benton painting. Part of our research for this installation, and particularly my research with the archives in preparation for the sort of adjunct show on the archive, was looking at the oral histories of our past directors. The Archives of American Art holds holds the recordings of a personal history by Bartlett Hayes, who was our director for over 20 years. And I was able to secure a transcript, which was quite, it was a 6+ hour long conversation. But what was quite fascinating is that they started off with the intention of stopping at every single work in the collection and having Bartlett Hayes say something about it. And they only got through the early B's before they moved on to a different topic because it was far too tedious. But luckily they did get to Benton. And I found this great quote. And this is something we knew nothing about before accessing this record, where he talks about the fact that this painting was flaking. And this was the 1930s rather. Painting had only been in the collection for a short amount of time. Don't mind the accession number at the bottom, that's incorrect. I don't know what I was thinking there. Should be a full year. I think it was accessioned really early in the 1930s, not 194. So Bartlett Hayes recounts that in about 1935, 34, 35, we noticed that the painting was cracking quite badly. Consequently, we got in touch with Benton in Kansas City and asked if we could send the picture out for his attention. Bartlett ended up traveling to Kansas City with the painting, which is by train, which is something that we would not advise nowadays. I can remember that Benton came down to the train to meet my wife and myself, and he immediately came back, took us back to his house, and called his wife saying that he had a surprise for her. I didn't know what he was up to, but it turned out that when she came in and we were introduced, he said, "I told her that you were going to be an old bearded gent." I was fairly young at the time. Well, as a consequence of that, we looked at the picture. He took out a penknife and began whacking at it. And I shuddered and said, "Don't do that, stop, stop." And he said, "Oh, well, we can paint it over again, all right." So basically, it would still be a Benton even if it was destroyed, because Benton could just repaint it. Luckily, he didn't have to repaint it. But again, bringing out these fun, or at least funny to us, anecdotes about works. Other kinds of behind the scenes things that we're able to tell because of our vast archival collections. This Whistler painting, Brown and Silver Old Battersea Bridge, which in art historical terms is a very important painting because it's was Whistler's first major commission and also his first painting of Battersea Bridge, which would go on to be a kind of a major place of significance for Whistler, and he would create many works referencing or depicting Battersea Bridge. But we also have in our files records of conservation treatment and X-ray and analysis of the painting, which when it was undertaken revealed that there was actually a self-portrait underneath the surface of the painting, which you can see on the right. Whistler was a poor kind of struggling artist at the time and had to reuse his canvases. So he reused this canvas painting over a self-portrait. The Addison is also fortunate enough to be able to claim many firsts. And one of our most celebrated firsts is the fact that we were the very first institution to give the Ashcan School painter, John Sloan, a retrospective. And this was quite late in his career that he received, or not quite late, but quite far along in his career when he received this kind of recognition. And we have these great letters, correspondence back and forth, including this letter where he outlines his plan for the catalog, which was an extraordinarily important document because he actually wrote his own anecdotes about each painting, each work represented in the exhibition. So we have things like his hand-drawn diagram for the plan of the catalog, along with his entire manuscript in our archive. So once you come out of that gallery, on the right-hand side, we have a small exhibition focused on Manhattan Bridge Loop, which is really a story about our archives and our institutional history. So I won't go into an analysis of Manhattan Bridge Loop, other than to say that it's one of the great masterworks in our collection and a work that is exceptionally evocative and continues to move people quite profoundly. What people may not know is that the Addison holds what I like to call the Rosetta Stone of Edward Hopper studies. Edward Hopper was somewhat cantankerous and was not a particularly loquacious person. He didn't write his own manifesto like many of his contemporaries. He resisted the urge or resisted the requests of many to interpret his work. But the Addison was the only institution to get him to actually reflect on his process in any profound way. So this is a letter from 1939 that that the Addison was able to solicit because the Addison was working on an exhibition focused solely on Manhattan Bridge Loop. It was an exhibition that ended up traveling to truly dozens of venues. It was called Architecture of a Painting, and it analyzed Edward Hopper's Manhattan Bridge Loop on a formal level. So it taught visitors about things like composition, form, subject matter, using the one painting as the sort of example. And it was a very innovative approach at the time to have a single object installation or exhibition. And Edward Hopper was clearly impressed and interested and intrigued. And he was written, Charles Sawyer wrote him a letter just asking for his general impressions on the painting. And he wrote back this document, which is actually on display. The original is on display at the Addison, perhaps for the first time ever. It's referenced in nearly every, or really in every book about Edward Hopper, but has not been publicly seen. And what's great about this is that we have this amazing, very deep sort of soul-searching letter where Hopper is talking about how and I'm quoting him now, "My aim in painting is always, using nature as the medium, to try to project upon canvas my most intimate reaction to the subject as it appears when I like it most, when the facts are given unity by my interests and prejudices. Why I select certain subjects rather than others, I do not exactly know, unless it is that I believe them to be the best mediums for a synthesis of my inner experience." So this has been a really important document that has guided a lot of the interpretation of Edward Hopper's work in the years since. He was also gracious enough to supply the Addison with 2 preliminary studies, as well as a photograph of the site of Manhattan Bridge Loop. This is a photograph of the installation. You can see the 3 works that Hopper donated on view in the 1940s. The show opened in 1940 and traveled for a few years afterwards. And here it was all about sort of positioning the painter as the visual architect, and you have kind of the clean line, angular form, this equation, clear-cut space plus simple color plus orderly composition equals harmony, precision, intelligibility, which were the hallmarks of this canvas. So moving across to the second part of the exhibition, we're looking at abstraction in our collection, which we were particularly strong in. So we'll stop here at Jackson Pollock's Phosphorescence. There's a fun story behind this. It was donated, it was a gift of Peggy Guggenheim, of course, the great patron of abstract expressionism, particularly of Pollock. Her collection is on view in her beautiful villa, canal side villa in Venice. And she wrote in the late 1940s to the Addison, asking if the Addison might be interested in accepting a work by Jackson Pollock. Many museums at that time would have said no. Pollock was well known, but he was not the household kind of canonical, certainly not the canonical household name that he is today. And most museums were quite reluctant to embrace fully abstract works. The Addison, on the other hand, had a very long track record of working with modern artists who created non-narrative work. And Peggy Guggenheim was aware of that and wrote to the Addison. The Addison, Bartlett Hayes, was a very shrewd negotiator. He was obsessed with quality and wanted to ensure that the Addison had the very best example of an artist's work. And he thought that another Jackson Pollock painting, 1A, which is now a highlight of MoMA's collection and is about 8 feet wide, thought that that would be a more suitable painting. Peggy Guggenheim didn't own the work and couldn't come up with the $3,000 needed to pay for it. And she offered instead 2 paintings, Phosphorescence and another smaller format work. Bartlett Hayes actually had the audacity to turn down one of the two Pollock paintings. We could have had both, but he turned down one because he thought phosphorescence was clearly better than the other. So here's a letter from Peggy Guggenheim, just finalizing or making clear that she was unable to, she says, "I'm sad to say that all I can offer you is one or both of the remaining Pollocks. I'm not in a position to make any other donation just now." These were works that were in her personal collection that she was looking to unload for tax purposes. Bartlett Hayes instead asked for her to buy something completely different. So he shot his shot, so to speak, and tried, but it's a funny story. Of course, in hindsight is 2020, and I may well have made the same exact call back in 1950, but to have the opportunity now to have two Pollocks and to only take one is somewhat humorous. Here's another view of the gallery. You can see Frank Stella on the far left, Maud Morgan dead center, and Hans Hoffman on the right. Hans Hoffman, a very important figure in the development of abstraction, and particularly its spread in the United States. Very notable instructor as well. Another great Addison first is that he had his very first retrospective at the Addison back in 1948. It was also the very first solo museum exhibition given to an abstract expressionist, and was accompanied by the very first publication of essays by an abstract expressionist. The work, the collection is called Search for the Real, and is one of the most important art historical texts of the 20th century. And the Addison published it back in 1948, and we have the original manuscripts for it in our collection. Another artist who had a very fruitful relationship with the Addison was Alexander Calder. His show 17 Mobiles by Alexander Calder was up at the Addison in the early 1940s. He was a good friend of art instructors Maud and Patrick Morgan, and was invited to show up at the Addison. And he sold the work that you see on the right, Horizontal Spines, to the Addison back in 1942. And I have a little bit more about Calder later on, actually right now. So we actually are fortunate enough to have retained a great deal of information and material around this exhibition, including Alexander Calder, or Sandy Calder's handwritten artist statement, where he talks about his influence and why he moved from stabiles to mobiles. And then he was also unable to come up to Andover to install the show. So he sent drawings, these installation drawings for all 17 mobiles, which is an incredible archival kind of resource that we have. So we've displayed all of the preliminary, or rather all of the drawings, installation drawings in our Museum Learning Center, along with this handwritten artist statement and a document relating to horizontal spines as well. The other side of the gallery. This painting by Joseph Albers, also allows us to access another great first, and is supported by this letter from our archive. The Addison was also the very first museum to give a solo exhibition to Joseph Albers. It was a very important exhibition. He was looking for acceptance, institutional acceptance in the United States. And the Addison was really one of the first, if not the first institution to sort of champion his work. And that was something that he never forgot, and donated a significant body of work at his death to the Addison in recognition of that. And this is a great letter on Black Mountain College stationery, where he's talking about how very honored he is that the Addison would show his work. And he also mentions that it is very difficult to obtain public interest in abstract art, which was very true, and set the Addison apart from the very beginning. New England is considered to have fairly conservative taste in terms of art. And certainly museum fellow institutions in the 1930s and 40s, primarily the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, were allergic to modern art. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston did not embrace modernism until it was almost too late for them to make really significant acquisitions. The Addison, on the other hand, was sort of seen as the New England outpost of MoMA. We took a lot of early MoMA shows and were really unafraid to show work that was quite provocative at its time. Now you look at this work and don't really see it as being particularly challenging or provocative, but it was quite radical to show purely abstract work at that time. The last section of the exhibition deals with the figure as a theme and is quite broad, and I really have to come in person to sort of piece it all together because it's quite complex. One of the key works in this section, and really one of the masterpieces in our collection, is Thomas Aiken's Salutot from 1898. The Addison was quite smart and decided to reach out to Thomas Aiken's widow, who was living at the time, still in Philadelphia. And she requested a photo postcard of Salutot. And she responded with this annotated postcard, which you can see on the left, which is on view, and a letter where she talks about each figure in the crowd of spectators, each identifiable figure, and tells us exactly who each one is. And this is information that would have been lost to time had she not committed it to paper, which just goes, kind of speaks to the fragility of memory, that this, the fact that we know that on the far right is Benjamin Aikens, Thomas Aiken's father, and that these other figures were all significant men in Aiken's life. That's information that likely would not have been retained otherwise had the Addison not kind of solicited that information by corresponding with Mrs. Aikens and then retained it for posterity. We also, through the course of research, came across some new firsts, things that we were not aware of necessarily, things that were in many cases hiding in plain sight, including the fact that the Addison was the very first institution to acquire and show the work of the famed photographer Francesca Woodman, who was a student at Abbott Academy and then also spent a year at Phillips Academy after the merger of Abbott and Phillips Academy. We didn't really, we kind of knew that we were probably one of the first, but we were able to definitively establish that we were the first museum to acquire and show her work. And we have wonderful things in our archives like this very typically Francesca Woodman type letter in her very distinctive kind of scrawl, her chicken scratch, where she's thanking Don Snyder, who's still around, a very well-respected, wonderful curator of photography. She says, thanks for being so patient, and goes on to provide an invoice for the 6 prints that we own by Francesca Woodman, each of which she sold for $30. So a great price. So the final section of this talk and of the exhibition is our museum learning center installation. And these are stories that we couldn't really tell within the gallery, but we thought that they were very significant and wanted to tell them somewhere. So we installed a number of works in our museum learning center in order to tell the institution's history. So one of the great things to arise out of this whole project was our determination that we were actually the very first museum to acquire and show the work of Ruth Asawa. And we have amazing correspondence between Bartlett Hayes and Ruth Asawa, including this beautiful letter with a hand-drawn snake. Certainly you can see that kind of arabesque biomorphic form echoing in this painting of these dancing figures. And it would later influence her wire sculptures, which are very organic and curvilinear, and for which she's extraordinarily well known. But she had her very first museum exposure here at the Addison, and that was part of an exhibition called Art Schools USA, which I'll talk about toward the end in a little bit more detail, but was a show that was launched by Bartlett Hayes in order to kind of provide audiences with a sense of what was going on in the art schools across America. So this went on for over a decade, and each year he would invite 25 different art schools, to each submit 5 artists for consideration. And those selected were able to send one work, and it was displayed at the Addison, and then a smaller section was sent on, a smaller segment of that was sent on tour. And because of that, we're able to hold a number of different firsts, which I'll speak to momentarily. I did mention early on that there was kind of an unfortunate Hassam story. So as I mentioned, Childe Hassam, who was quite elderly at the time, was invited to come to Andover to paint the campus while the Addison was under construction. We have one painting that Childe Hassam executed in Andover, which is on display, called Painting of Pearson Hall from 1930. The others were not acquired because they were not deemed worthy of the Addison's collection. And we have this really fantastic letter by Robert McIntyre writing to Charles Sawyer, the curator, first curator / director of the Addison, saying, "Yesterday I wrote to Mr. Hassam, telling him in effect that the pictures he painted in Andover will not do, with the possible exception of Pearson Hall, which is the painting we do now own. And I now await his answer, which will probably bristle with brimstone and fire with quaking knees. And if I have strength enough left after reading or hearing what he has to say, I shall let you know how he feels about the whole thing." So gives you a sense maybe that Hassam was a fiery gentleman, but also I'd be quite insulted if I happened to be in Hassam's shoes. It wasn't as though we didn't have a very strong body of Hassam's work in the collection. We have dozens of works by Hassam and had a number of his works in the very core founding collection. But this material was just not up to snuff. Again, gives you a sense of how really how focused the founders of the Addison were on achieving this kind of level of excellence when it came to quality, but also gives a sense of the kind of complicated dynamics between artists and patrons. And unfortunately, we don't have the response, which I would love to find Childe Hassam's response to this. If he wrote a response, we simply don't have it, because I imagine he was quite frustrated. The last big story I'll tell is the relationship between the Addison and Charles Sawyer. So Childe Hassam was you could make a case for him being one of the first, if not the first, artist in residence, but it was not an officially sanctioned artist residency. But the very first official artist residency at Andover at the Addison was the 1946 residency of Charles Sheeler, who by then was an extraordinarily accomplished artist known for his precisionist works, depict in photography and painting, worked across media with quite a lot of virtuosity. He is probably best known for his industrial scenes. He was invited by Bartlett Hayes, which is outlined in this letter, to come to campus. And Bartlett Hayes essentially invented the modern day artist in residence program, where he's talking about in this letter that art, you can just, a curator can go to any museum or any gallery and buy a work, but that work doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the community the museum is located in or the public that curator serves. And he makes the case that it would be far more impactful to actually invite an artist to come into a community and then acquire a work that the artist created from that community. And so Charles Sheeler wrote, there's wonderful correspondence. Charles Sheeler's incredible sense of humor comes through loud and clear in these letters, where he and his wife came up, spent about a month here on campus, and that was only made possible because they were allowed to bring their dachshund Ebony. And the Andover Inn just across the street from the Addison made an exception. It gave them their own suite, which had a separate entrance, were allowed to bring their dog, and they had really the best time ever. It's in these letters, it makes it seem like they had just the greatest time here on campus. And here's a portrait of Ebony taken, we believe, behind Andover Inn, sitting upright. And this is also on view in our show. And this letter where he's asking Bart Hayes if he could bring the third member of the family, Ebony. And that was kind of the leading decision, or the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back and convinced him to come visit. While he was here, he didn't actually paint. Instead, he photographed, and he was very drawn to Ballardvale, which is an area of Andover that is was known for its textile production. By the time that Schiller visited in 1946, the mills were abandoned largely. And he saw them as these kind of large carcasses. He describes them in subsequent letters, but he was really drawn to the geometry of these structures. And he photographed. We have a number of those photographs in our collection. And what he did is he would return to his studio with those photographs and translated them into these very complex geometric compositions. And so the work that was eventually selected for the Addison's collection, Ballard Vale, which is one of Schiller's great late career works, you can see directly inspired by his time at Andover, and this amazing, almost point counterpoint that we can establish between the photograph and the final composition. And Schiller really credited this residency, along with a later residency up in Manchester, with the revitalization of his own artistic career and his own sort of inspiration toward the end of his life. He would return to the motif of Ballard Vale. We have a later watercolor, Ballard Vale Revisited, and then almost a decade later, he would return once again to Ballard Vale and his source material from Ballard Vale to create New England irrelevancies. We have a study of that painting, which hangs in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, also on view in our Museum Learning Center. And then finally, this 90th anniversary has presented a really wonderful opportunity for us to reflect on our history and to learn more about our history. And it's led to a number of really fantastic discoveries. One of the first during our process was to establish that Andy Warhol actually had his very first museum exposure at the Addison, alongside Ruth Asawa and Kenneth Nolan in the Art Schools USA exhibition, which also was the first exhibition for a number of other artists like Jay DeFeo, Paul Warner, Manuel Neri, and it drew from all across the United States. So a lot of artists who maybe had been seen in a small group show in California had their first kind of mainstream exposure in New England because of this project. So we've been able to connect all of these dots, and we've received some great coverage. Blake Gopnik, who is the preeminent Warhol scholar, wrote about Warhol's, wrote about this painting that was shown at the Addison, first work by Andy Warhol. He was Andy Warhol then to appear in a museum anywhere. The Woodman Foundation I've been working with to kind of dig deeper into this very early exposure of Francesca Woodman's work and the influence of Andover on her career. And we've also, as I mentioned, discovered that Jay DeFeo, famed for her multi-ton painting, The Rose, which is at the Whitney, also had her first museum exposure here at the Addison. So it's been a great period of just discovery, which makes it very exciting. So the archive is vast. It's still revealing itself. The collection continues to grow. And we continue to learn more about what we have. And so with that, I believe that's my last slide. I'd be delighted. I know that I've gone over a little bit over time, not as badly as I normally do, but if there are any questions, I'll leave on an attractive slide. And I'm happy to answer any questions that may have come up.
Okay, thank you, Gordon. That was great, fascinating. So I'll just go in order. When you were giving us a little tour of the archives, someone asks, do you have a sense of what would be digitized first? And does it all need to be digitized?
That's something that's really hard to answer. I think as someone who works in a library, you'll know that digitization is never ending. And
right.
This is a project, quite frankly, that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. It would likely require a grant from IMLS or something like that. I think priority-wise, I would love to get the first decade of the Addison's history digitized. So the art, all of the correspondence around building the collection that we have, correspondence with other museum directors, that would be kind of a good place to begin. I think at the end of the day, everything will, that's kind of the direction we're all headed in, is a world where everything is digitized, which is the world that we want to be in, quite frankly. And as someone who researches, does a lot of research professionally, and during the pandemic, being unable to go to libraries, the fact that a lot of collections are available online was a real lifesaver. So we would eventually like to be able to share the depths of our archives online. But again, this is something that takes a lot of time and money. But we have to start somewhere. I think we can start chronologically. I think the last thing that would be done would probably be the artist records, as there's more sensitive information contained within those documents that we might, have to go through more carefully.
Okay. And someone asks, was Lizzie Bliss, related to Zadie Cobb Bliss? Do you know?
Yeah, so they were sisters-in-law.
Okay. And somebody says, so interesting to know the stories and histories behind these paintings. Would be neat to have access to these stories while looking at the paintings in person. Any plans to do something like this in the future?
Well, I will say a lot of the stories are in our reaching for a prop. We published a massive catalog now about 30 almost ago, called Addison, Curator of American Art 65 Years, which is an amazing resource. And a lot of books published in the 90s, you look at it and kind of cringe, but this one has held up beautifully. Even the design, it looks pretty contemporary. And this has a lot of great information about works in the collection and a lot of history of the Addison. In terms of some way of having almost, you're kind of describing like an audio tour almost. That's not something that we typically have done. Again, it's something that requires a lot of time and resources, and we're a very small staff. But this will live on. So if you want to revisit any of the stories, but really the labels, if you come see the installation, the labels have a lot of the information that I talked about today. And then also our website. A lot of the works in our collection have long essays attached to their records online. So if you're curious about anything, you can look it up there as well. So who knows what the future holds. I think, maybe the 100th anniversary will publish another catalog, if such a thing, if publications are still happening in 10 years, who knows? But we'll see.
Yes.
But I appreciate that.
Okay. And someone did ask, what's a rough estimate of the cost of digitizing just the first decade?
Oh, I have no idea.
No idea.
No
okay.
idea.
Well, we're getting, as usual, people are singing your praises for being an amazing lecturer, which I completely agree with them. And I'll let the audience know. So this recording will be available probably in about a week, if not sooner. As soon as it's available, you'll get a follow-up email and it'll have the link to it, and it will live on the library's website. And I know the Addison will post it as well, so you will have access to it. We don't send out the Zoom link. We actually do a little bit of formatting, and we also are closed captioning all the videos, so our staff actually goes through and tries to correct the captions and make them very accurate. So it can take a little bit of time.
And I'll just mention, when we were talking about digitization, it's very rare for a museum to have their entire archives digitized. I'd say the only one I can really think of off the top of my head is MoMA. What is amazing about the Addison is that our entire collection is digitized. So even though our archival material may not be readily available online, the collection itself is. So if you go on our website, really almost all of our 23,000 plus art object collection can be pulled up. And so we're ahead of the game that way. But again, we're trying to come up with some sort of strategy for the archive.
Right. Does the museum loan many of its works? And are you ever reluctant to loan for conservation reasons?
Yeah, so we are very frequent. When I was working at another museum, I learned about the Addison at being a very generous lender, which I've noticed to be the case now that I work at the Addison. We're eager. We support most of the loan requests that come to us. For example, we have loans that are circulating around the country. Currently, our major Georgia O'Keeffe Wave Night is up at the Peabody Essex Museum. We have several American Impressionist works in Texas. We lend internationally. At the very beginning of 2020, I actually was able to escort a Marston Hartley painting back from Denmark and bring a Hopper painting to Switzerland. So we do lend, and that's a way for us to promote the study of American art, but then also to promote ourselves, because quite frankly, Andover is not necessarily an arts mecca, and we're kind of, it's a small town. We're not right in Boston. We don't have hundreds of thousands of visitors, but people kind of get to know us in many cases through our collection, where they'll see. I mean, I can even vaguely remember going to some exhibition when I was, a teenager, and seeing that the work was, from Phillips Academy, and thinking, why does this high school have this art collection? So that's kind of like the gateway drug for a lot of people, where they see us out in the world of exhibitions, or see our works that mentions us, and then they learn more about us, and eventually we hope come to visit us. So when it comes to conservation and lending works, that's a primary concern. A lot of times, if a museum would like to borrow work and it has condition issues, we'll make the loan contingent upon conservation treatment. In that case, the museum that's borrowing the work would pay for the conservation treatment. So that's happened several times recently. Frame conservation also. So we will not lend a work if it would be detrimental to its stability and the longevity of the work to lend. And so it's always kind of a careful balance, wanting to support the project, but then also wanting to ensure that our collection is safe. And we will of course only lend to institutions that meet our our standards for security and climate control and that kind of thing as well. So
right. So someone asks, what percentage of the collection is sculpture? And then second part is any decorative arts?
So sculpture, we probably have, it's in the hundreds of objects rather than thousands in terms of sculpture. That's hard to kind of break apart. Sculpture was never the primary focus of collecting, although we do have a significant but not particularly large sculpture collection. It was not the number one concern at the very beginning. We were sort of perceived, or kind of, we were kind of designed as a picture gallery. So two-dimensional works were really focused on. That isn't to say that we don't have a nice sculpture collection, but it's not a huge portion of our collection. Decorative is another story. We made a pretty conscious decision fairly early on to collect decorative arts. The Garvin collection, which is now at Yale, was partially on deposit here at the Addison, but then that was withdrawn and everything went to Yale. We have a few things here and there, a lot of silver in the collection, silver, some glass, some furniture, just kind of a few examples of high quality. And it's again something where you have to recognize that we don't exist in a bubble, that we're in a much larger Boston museum community, and that museums like the MFA Boston, the Peabody Essex Museum, they've been collecting decorative arts for literally hundreds of years, and
right.
we would be able to catch up or build a comparatively strong collection. So I love decorative arts. I love ceramics in particular. So it's something that I kind of try to sneak in as much as I can, but I think it's really works that, and it's a distinction that's really tricky also between what do you mean by decorative arts, but really works that have strong artistic merit that you might consider decorative arts. That's totally fair game to acquire, but it's not something that we very actively pursue.
Got it. And someone asks, does digitization maintain the true color of the object?
That's, it depends on who's the digitization. When we work with photographers who specialize in photographing works of art and use color correction. So we're careful. I mean, we have multiple layers of digitization and documentation. We have super high res images of many works in our collection that are publication quality. And then we just have, digital camera shots of some things that are, not, that we haven't gotten around to photographing professionally. So it's a big range, but in all cases, we strive for accuracy.
So 2 questions came in about, so going forward, will your mission to collect American art include Native American artists?
Yes, I'll answer that right off the bat. And that we've actually acquired, we are in the process of acquiring works by Indigenous American artists. And one of the very first work by an living Indigenous American artist to enter our collection is on view in our 90th anniversary show. And that is a painting called Drive Through by the celebrated Salish artist, Jean Quick-to-See Smith. And so that is up right now. So I invite you to see it. And I can't announce right now because there's still acquisitions in the pipeline, but we are making a very concerted effort to acquire works by living Native American artists because it's a gap in the collection that has persisted for far too long. I think also the fact that we're not the only museum at Andover. There's also the Peabody Institute, and their collection is comprised primarily of objects of Indigenous American origin. So I think there's always been sort of, not wanting to step on anyone's toes or not wanting to overlap. But in terms of fine art work by living Indigenous American artists, something that we're building a collection of, and it's really top of mind and something that I'm particularly passionate about.
And just to follow on that is what steps are being taken to collect works from non-U.S. citizens living permanently in America? Is there any?
So I'm afraid that there's no wiggle room in our terms of trust, which is a legal document that we're bound to follow. I think if we deviate from that, there's this provision that like the governor of Massachusetts, the president of Harvard, the president of Yale, all have to sign off, and then we would be dissolved essentially. So in terms of non-US citizens living permanently in America, it's something that part of our history, so I talk about it, but again, I think thinking about the last couple of years in America, well, it's really the last several centuries in America, but particularly in the anti-immigrant rhetoric that's arisen in the last 5 years or so, it casts this policy in a kind of a different light. We can show anyone we want, and we show works by artists who are living in the United States, who are not necessarily naturalized with some frequency. But in terms of acquiring work with permanent collection, there's no wiggle room there. We work creatively around that. In some cases, there's certain loopholes, like we can acquire photographs by non-US artists. So we have photographs of Martin Luther King by Cartier-Bresson, for example. So there are these loopholes, but in terms of painting, sculpture, we are bound to follow the terms of trust.
Got it. And someone asks, does the library have a copy? Oh, do we? You're asking me this. I'm sure we do. And can that 65-year catalog be purchased through the museum?
Yes, we have boxes of them. So.
Oh, okay.
I know that. I think our museum shop supervisor was on the call earlier, and she'll tell you we have plenty to go around.
Okay.
It's a beautiful publication, and I think it's at a pretty deeply discounted rate. So come and pick up a copy.
Super. Okay. Well, I think actually, here's an idea for an exhibition.
Okay.
Have you ever consider doing an exhibition on just great artists who graduated from Andover or of great Andover art teachers?
Yep. So that's been done in the past. We haven't done that kind of show recently. What's unique about the 90th, and it's something that we're actually going to continue doing, is that we've started to include icons on our labels. And there are 2 different icons. One is a little figure with a graduation cap on, and that indicates that the artist attended Phillips Academy or Abbott Academy, or was a member of faculty. And then we also have another icon, a palette icon, that indicates that an artist was an artist in residence. So we are showing off the fact that so many incredible artists have worked with us, but then also have come from Phillips Academy. There have been many shows over the years that have focused solely on alumni artists. There was a show in the, I think it was 80s that took a decade, each decade for the last like 6 decades at that point, and chose an artist and showed work by graduate artists. Big Joseph Cornell display, Frank Stell was in that show. But we're really celebrating that aspect, and I'm glad that you brought it up because it's not something I talked about, but we are really celebrating the fact that so many important artists have really strong ties to Andover through our 90th anniversary exhibition. So I think you also learn a lot of even people who went here don't realize that certain artists went to Andover. So it's a really fun learning experience and kind of a surprise to see just how many people have connections here.
All right. Well, thank you, Gordon. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much. This was great, and we'll get the recording as quickly as possible.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everyone.